And a very good evening to you, and welcome to today's edition of Politics 101. It's Thursday evening, and wherever you are, whether you are in Guyana, in the wider Caribbean, North America, Europe, wherever you are, welcome to Politics 101. Uh, this week we've been dealing with Black History Month, and today we want to pivot and to bring you that long-awaited analysis of the budget from the WPA's perspective. Last week, of course, we heard from the PNC, the AFC, the Guyana Trade Union Congress, and we unfortunately had to cancel the WPA show, but they're on this evening, and we are going to be hearing their perspective on the budget. Of course, since last week, the debates came to an end, and this week we've had the consideration of the estimates for the various agencies, the Committee of Supply, as they call them. It's when the opposition get to quiz the ministers responsible for the various departments on the monies that have been allocated. And it's when we get to see where monies were hidden. We get to hear what the monies would be spent on and so on. So 1 week later, we have a broader view of the budget, and hopefully we'll incorporate that broader view in our discussion tonight. As we come to press, there have been developments this week. The Mr. Sue development, it's been all over the news, and Vice President Jagdeo was confronted by a journalist from a foreign news outfit on alleged kickback, bribery, relating to the Chinese in the timber industry. And I'm sure you all have been following that. I myself have been following all the discussions around it. We weighed in on it yesterday morning, and since then there have been more developments. What is interesting here, as I said yesterday morning, is that the government is, or Mr. Jagdeo, is saying that his government, he and his government, are the victims of a trade war between the United States and China, giving one the impression that his government's partiality or alleged partiality to the Chinese may have gotten the Americans angry, and so the Americans are retaliating against them. And he went on to cite the removal of the PPP from government in the 1960s for ideological reasons, stop short of talking about the same kind of operation 2 years ago. And I cited Mr. Rohi's Mr. Ramatars, former President Ramatars, warning to the PPP about a year ago that they would be subject to external pressures. This is most interesting because, of course, it could open the door to a lot more. We remember Sarah, and Dr. Thomas is not here for that tonight, but it would be remiss of me not on your behalf ask him to weigh in on this whole question of corruption, because he was the head of Sarah, trying to recover state assets. And when the government came to power, the PPP, they promptly closed down Sarah. But apparently some of the Sarah work is now being done by external agencies. I think, as I said, the PPP, felt that they're not accountable to the Guyanese people, and that because the external forces came down on their side 2 years ago, they're not, in a sense, accountable in that regard. That those external forces will turn a blind eye. What they forgot is that there are agencies within the United States which would be active wherever the US has an interest. The US has a big interest in Guyana vis-a-vis Exxon, and news agencies would be covering Guyana. And anything like official corruption and unofficial corruption would be captured by those agencies. And from what I'm understanding is that news agency may have been after something else and stumbled upon Mr. Su. We'll wait and see what happens. Moon run till they catch them. And then we had that stuff in the parliament yesterday, the National Assembly. I just don't know what to say. What to say. Look at those people in there. Look at the type of discussion. A government minister retaliating to heckling by talking about dildo and reducing. Look, I don't think it's even worth discussion. And then the speaker punishing Duncan for retaliating, standing up for the female MP to whom the comment was allegedly directed, and not reprimanding or punishing the perpetrator. I mean, these people are something else. But I suppose you all are correct to say we've been saying that every day. Every day we've been saying that, and every day they get worse. Anyhow, welcome down to Politics 101, and tonight we're going to be talking about the budget. Please share the link, and we're going to hear from the Working People's Alliance, their perspective on the budget. We have with us tonight Tacuma Ogunseye, executive member of the WPA. Kidakie Amsterdam, another WPA executive, and Professor Clive Thomas, WPA elder, and well-known economist, not only well-known in Guyana, but in the larger Caribbean region and afar. And I know a lot of you in the audience would want to hear Professor Thomas's take on the budget and by extension the WPAs. So, gentlemen, welcome to Politics 101.
Thank you.
And Professor Thomas, let me start with you on the breaking news, if you want to call it that, of the Mr. Sue Gate that has broken. Have you been following it, Dr. Thomas?
I'm not really familiar with the details of it. I haven't read the original interview. Today I've been reading a lot of comments in the media online on the matter. But it fits in with the broader issue of the budget. Because I had labeled the state that we had in Guyana as a criminalized state, functioning to generate opportunities for corruption and the diversion of the surplus into the private hands of the political class. So that sort of development does not surprise me. I would have expected that it might take a little more time for it to have begun to surface, but this might be a leftover from the earlier times. So in that sense, it's very important. It also is relevant to the budget because the budget is more than just a statement of what a government intends to do in terms of collecting taxes and spending on projects and ideas that they have for developing the country. It is also an opportunity for them to locate the concepts that they have for driving the country forward. I think what this budget displays to me, which I do not think the press has so far picked up on, is that we are in a remarkable state of inflection at this point in time. For the first time, we can say we have a budget where the management of plenty is more and more important than the management of too little. The budget was able to draw down on the resources earned from the sale of oil and gas, well, mainly oil, crude oil, from late 2019, all of 2020 and 2021. And that was a humongous sum. In fact, despite the press that we get in Guyana, which tends to poo-poo the earnings from oil and try to make it look as if it's something that's incidental, the earnings from oil in those 2 years, 2020 and 2021, doubled. And in fact, the projection going forward to 2025, which the budget also cites, has it growing by a multiple of 4 to 2025. And that reaches over $1 billion in oil revenue that is expected, which means for the first time in our history, we can talk about a budget or a budgetary situation where the government has the capacity to change things and influence the direction of development of the country. I have not prepared a budget, so no one can accuse me of having manufactured the data that I give you here. Literally, the amount of money in the National Resource Fund doubled between 2020 and 2021 to nearly 630 million US dollars. Is expected to quadruple to 2025. And to my mind, the primary task of the budget has to be one where we seek to remove the most important scourge that is inhibiting the development and a good life in Guyana, and that is systemic poverty. And that is why we have adopted in the WPA a commitment to promoting the notion of the Buxton proposal, which is a grant ultimately to reach 5,000 US dollars for every family in Ghana. And the average size of a family is 4.2 persons. So we're talking about individually an annual grant in the region of 1,000 US per person, 1,000 to 1,500. That will be enough, I think, to at least for the next 10 years or so, to maintain people at a living standard that you cannot say that they're suffering from monetary poverty, money poverty, income poverty. In that sense, I think we would be able to say one thing we get out of oil is a transition from a poor and increasingly poor country relatively to the rest of the world into a country where we are able to sustain livelihoods comfortably above the poverty level. I do not think that this budget paid any attention to that notion. It sees the plenty that we are now walking into as a source of plenitude for distribution to people who will support the government's project, who have supported the government's project in getting back into office, and who are constituents of its own, whether by tradition, by aspiration, or whatever reason you want to give, and they would divert the funds towards the consolidation of those groups' position within the economy. So I think that it's incumbent upon the opposition and the way we approach the budget to bring those issues into sharp relief. The budget is not just an income statement. It's also a statement about the quality of life, the direction of life. It's a social, political, cultural, all a many dimensional instrument, and it has to be treated as such. And if the aim of the budget ultimately is to self perpetuate a group in position that is consolidated at this point in time, then the budget defeats the aim of developing Guyana. And from that perspective, I think that it's regrettable that the opposition finds itself in this position. Because if ever there was a need for a clear sighted, um, vigorous, insightful governance to take the country forward, where we begin to think that the problems are plenty rather than too little, we are on the cusp of it right now. And therefore, to me, the waste of that potential is one of the most harrowing things I have to personally experience. It will be bitter regret that we find ourselves in a position where we are on the eve of this tremendous breakthrough in terms of the potential to change the material conditions of life in Guyana, and it's in the hands of a government like this. That is my basic recommendation and position on the budget. It shares blame both with the government that has left us or was removed from office, because they too shall see this opportunity and shall be more inventive and far-seeing in their approaches towards dealing with the problems of the country. And do not leave it to these people to have so much to distribute that they can boast of giving everybody something, and you can't deny that they have it to give. That's the basic situation we find ourselves in now.
Mhm. Quite a stinging opening statement there from the WPA elder and economist, really taking us behind the numbers and really making that important point that that it's a shame that now, with an opportunity to move the country forward with the kind of wealth, the kind of resources, the kind of monies that are at the disposal of a government in Guyana for the first time, it is left in the hands of this PPP government, which is perhaps the worst government we have experienced in our post-colonial history. Let me bring in here Tacuma Ogunseye. Tacuma, I know you are not an economist, but as far as your perspective on the budget, for you, what this budget reflects. You have to unmute yourself and you have to go in the light. You have to unmute yourself. We're not hearing you. While Tacuma is trying to work his stuff out there, Kidakie, let me bring you in. From a large perspective, Kidakie Amsterdam, what does this budget say? From a large perspective, following up on Professor Thomas's introduction.
Well, the budget does say a lot. It says a whole lot that if you pay very close attention to it, you might end up depressed. It says, for example, that the government has no interest in improving a lot of public servants. It has no interest in improving a lot of what I would say some communities, some geographic areas in the country. It certainly has no interest in improving a lot of the have-nots, as I like to call them, in the society. Because if you look at the budget, what you will see is a lot of big spending on big and shiny things. Lots of spending on roads, lots of spending on big buildings, but very little spending on what I would consider the social services and the improvement of wages and salaries and people's living condition. So from a broad perspective, the budget says to me that, we don't really care much about the ordinary man. We are going to give more to those who have. And those who don't have, you can sit and wait for the crumbs.
Thank you very much, Dave Kidakie. Let's go back to Tacuma Ogunseye. Tacuma, ready for us?
Are you hearing me?
Yes, we are hearing you now, Tacuma. From a WPA perspective, as someone who has grown up in the WPA's and its radical view about transformation in the society, how do you view this budget?
I want to first endorse everything that has been said, both by Professor Thomas and by Kidakie. And I wish to add that it is important for us and to reinforce the point that Steve was making, that as a nation, one of the most saddest moments in our country history is what we are experiencing. When we have had for the first time in the history of the country a chance for local rulers to demonstrate political maturity and to understand the historic context and the historic moment that oil and later gas opened up to the country. And that is to give local rulers for the first time, the local population as a whole, a chance to reconfigure the economy and the social situation in the country that was fashioned by King's sugar and slavery and indenture. And instead of the PPP using this important moment to build national consensus and to rise above petty politics and post-election rhetoric, they have chosen to push the country on the road of confrontation and division. So that is the first observation, and I want to make. And for us in the WPA, this is indeed a sad moment. I want to remind the country that even before oil, in the WPA have had a very keen interest in the consequences of economic development on the various ethnic groups. And I remember in one of our manifestos in the 80s, and Brother UC Koyana was, I think, at the time in Parliament, where he moved a motion, and the manifesto had made a call for us to have an annual impact statement of how the various ethnic groups are performing in the economy, to see what is the effect of government budgetary policies and the economic and social policies, what effect it is having on the various ethnic groups. And I want to resubmit that into the national discourse, because I think that one of the worst things to happen to us is if oil and gas lead to the worsening of the economic disparities between the ethnic groups. And we in the Working People's Alliance are very concerned about it, because we believe it lies at the soul of whether this country will make good our achievement of independence, or whether we will walk down the road of division.
Myself. So Tacuma, you are making a linkage there between ethnic peace and distribution of resources. And as you look at this budget, you are seeing the potential for the opposite. Is that what you're saying? Tacuma? We seem to have lost Tacuma there. Let us go back to Professor Thomas.
My answer is yes to your question.
Okay. Keep yourself unmuted, Tacuma. Let's go back to Professor Thomas. Professor, you made your opening statement. As you look at the budget and you look at where the government is spending monies, do you think that that could lead in the short term to some kind of development, despite all the other problems that we see with the budget? Is there potential for some minimum development the way the budgetary allocation are done in the budget there?
I think, unfortunately, can you hear me?
Yes.
I think, unfortunately, I have to agree with Ogun. Unfortunate for the country, that is. If you remember, the public servants did not get a wage increase in 2021. They got a small one in 2020. Sorry, I think it's the other way around. They got a small one in 2019 and 2020. They didn't get. They didn't get any, and they got a 7% increase. But that increase has been overtaken by the inflation rate, which everybody who has had some professional relationship with economics has said is an accounting of the rate of inflation in Guyana. It could not be only 5.7%. The global rate is probably higher than that. We had to subjected to all the increases created through the difficulties in the value chain that affected Guyana. Some things you can't get. Others that were being supplied were affected by the floods that we had, extensive floods, damaged the farmlands, damaged the access roads, and that type of thing. And there was even a document prepared by the National Disaster Committee that talked to the increasing impopularization of sectors of Guyana because of high prices. So the 5.7% inflation rate that the government has in the budget, I believe, is an estimate. And if you take that into account, there's been no real monetary increase in the income going to the public servants. So from that point of view, despite the doubling of oil output, despite the doubling of the export value, despite a growth rate of 46.5% in GDP in that year, the public servants end up with virtually nothing because the rate in which the prices were increasing negated the 7% increase that they offered to the public servants. There was also the situation related to that they offered a grant of 250,000 to sugar workers on top of the grant that was given to them when the sugar industry had found itself necessary to end their employment and met all the terms of the termination of the contract and pay them benefits. And this so in a situation where we could never ever produce sugar at a competitive price. And we were in the midst of a serious effort to turn the sugar industry around through diversification into some of the projects that are now appearing as if they're new projects, projects that are at least several years old and which were already in the pipeline for future development. One of them, the most spectacular, was of course the fish farming. We signed a contract with the largest fish producers in the world, food farming fish producers in Miami, Florida. And the estate was about to embark upon that. Started to think about it. But if this problem did not end or start with the PPC government, even the government at the time, the APNU government, failed to realize that a big, gigantic industry like sugar can't be turned around on a dime. You can't turn around an institution that is several hundred years old. And 6 months. It takes time, it takes effort, it takes commitment to the struggle. You can't agree to enter a process, start it, and then abandon it because you are fearful that you might be creating criticisms of yourself when the criticisms are unfounded. And the only way you can salvage the rights and the responsibilities and the future for the people in those industries is in fact to go through the reforms. They can still have to be met at some point in time. And then you end up taking out a loan of $30 billion to subsidize an industry that if you were to sell it, you just deduct the $30 billion from the sale price and put the responsibility of turning it around on the private purchaser. That is what we were recommending. But it's a ridiculous proposition to have agreed to take out a loan of that size, born the future of Ghana, to salvage an industry like that. And my concern is that, given the nature of the politics, a lot of the surpluses or the gains we're getting from oil and gas will be seeped out in this way, leaked out in this way, to satisfy the needs of the political constituencies of the present ruling political class. That is my concern. So Ogun has made a very important point that if we use the oil and gas to perpetuate division and conflict, and that is certainly one area of conflict, the way in which you handle two different constituencies, you're setting up yourself for more disaster. So we, as I told you, the politics of how we manage plenty, while easier, is also a politics of great difficulty. It may not be as severe as the politics of poverty, but it is a politics problem that's of tremendous gargantuan size. And we need to address that as well. And this is why I think it is so distressing that we are as far removed from any form of national going forward as we ever were.
the 2022 budget as a source of potential widening of the ethnic divide in Guyana. The WPA is arguing that that is one of the major problems with this budget. Kidakie Amsterdam, you've been spending a lot of time going through the allocations to the various constituencies at the regional level where monies are being spent. Talk to us about how the spending allocations that you have been paying attention to reinforces the point made by Brother Ogun and endorsed by Brother Thomas, that this budget has the potential of widening the ethnic divide in the country.
Well, when you look at the allocations, and the allocations, let's say critical infrastructure, things like farm to market roads or farm access roads, community access roads, even healthcare facilities and educational facilities. When you look at the allocation of monies, those things, what you see is that the majority of the big spending in those different quote unquote sectors goes to areas that are traditionally PPP Indo-Guyanese dominant, right? When you do a comparison, you recognize that it's just a minimum, a very small percentage of those big spending that is going to find itself into Afro-Guyanese communities or even Amerindo-Guyanese communities. The majority is spent in areas that are predominantly Eastern.
Give us some data, Kidakie, to back what you're saying.
Let's
give us some specific examples of what you're talking about.
Okay, when I talk about farm access roads, let me see farm access roads. Farm access roads are very important for economic growth of communities, because if your road access is not all weather, it means that you can only produce at certain points of the year, or even if you intend to produce all year round, you're going to suffer major losses when the weather changes. You have farm access roads that are going to be constructed at Parika, Big Baibu, Molson Creek, Abari. Those are predominantly Indo-Guyanese areas. The one area that you might consider mixed or of Afro-Guyanese occupancy is Timiri. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5 or 6 areas that access roads are going to be constructed, but only one Afro-Guyanese or mixed community is going to benefit from such roads. If you look at bridges, you have bridges being done at Cane Grove, Good for Wacton, Mahaika, right? Again, if you look at those areas, you will recognize the bias in the allocation of resources to those bridges. Roads. You have roads at Mahaika, Newtonsville, Prospect, Martysville, Mont Repose, Mocha, and Cane Grove, right? Those are roads to be upgraded and constructed. And my argument here is that the only reason you see a road listed for Mocha, as we came to realize just the other day, is because of that bypass, if you want to call it that, the East Bank East Coast linkage. And that's the only reason you have a road listed for Mocha. And anybody who understands the importance of commuting and such likes for community development, growth and development of businesses, economic development, will recognize immediately that all of these resources being spent to aid the development of that kind of movement in the communities are predominantly in Indo-Guyanese communities.
Kidakie Amsterdam, they're giving us some data where infrastructural development are being targeted to. That, of course, we talk about, the government talks about how much money it's spending on the infrastructure. But as you open the budget and you look at where monies are being spent, you see a clear bias there in terms of the community. So let's move to the area of social class. A budget for the rich rather than a budget for the poor. Professor Thomas, you want to come in here on the social bias in the budget, if I may use that term?
Yes, certainly. I think from what has been said already by Kidakie and Ogun to some extent and myself, the very fact that the wages for public servants have not kept pace with the inflation rate underscores the problem of the poor becoming relatively poorer. And increasing subsidies to the private sector, as they term it, to mine reflect two things. One is payback for the support they gave them during the election process, because everybody is aware of that. And everybody is aware of the mounting debts to private business that the present ruling party had accumulated, and the importance of therefore getting a political settlement to repay those debts. So that was one important factor driving the inequality, the inequalization of the distribution of income. And the other factor is, of course, the accumulation among the party elites and their friends through contacts and preferences they had for supporting their own kin or kinship, if you want to call it that. The kinship rules that rule Guyana. And this means, therefore, that the distribution of income is subject to a dynamic that drives inequality. And that is why we in the WPA had adopted the principle that the Buxton proposal distribution of the $1 million grant or the 5,000 US grant will be given to every household, irrespective of race. So there can be no question or suggestion that some effort is being made to pump money in some quarters. That might have resulted in some people at the top getting more than they deserve, but to some extent that would have been corrected by the taxation they've had to pay. But the small price to pay to ensure that our hands were clean, that we're treating everyone with equal justice, and there's no prejudicial arrangements in the process. For example, since the government has come to power, they've distributed income, let's say my neighborhood. Some of my neighbors feel that they give the people based on the reasons why they think they support it, might be supporters of the PPP and not other groups. And I wouldn't make a fuss over it because it's not the nature of the PPA to complain if they don't get subsidies when they probably don't absolutely need it. But it creates opportunities for people to be unequal in their posted distribution of things. And that is why I'm personally very opposed to these ad hoc measures of distributing things, because they come as a type of handout we're accustomed to from colonial masters. People give people expecting something in return. They're not seen as a duty to citizenship, a right of a Guyanese. It's a favor we're doing for you. And once that ekes into it, it dehumanizes the recipient. It makes the thing corrupt. And I personally believe that for every $100 they spend in that way, only 60 or 70 cents of it, or $70 out of the 100, is really effective. Because they have to establish principles of clean, unadulterated equality. You send out things to people by their zip code, as the Americans would say, or if you lived in Europe, what they would say. Because this is a poor neighborhood and it's given to everybody that way. But once you begin to go into homes and send people with who are supposed to be some public servants with vouchers, so you have to sign before you get it, it introduces an element of personal interaction that is very anti-democratic. It is very subjugating for the recipients, almost humiliating. That is why we're never going to line up in no line to collect a voucher, even though I might might need it. I
But
don't want nobody to have me seen a line
in a
waiting for
line, yeah.
$20. Yeah.
See why make the distinction between these handouts that the government is giving and the cash transfer that the WPA has been championing through, because some people seem to be making the argument that what the PPP is doing is what the WPA proposed, which is cash transfer. Make that distinction for
But
us.
that is what I'm trying to do here.
Yes.
Because the cash transfer, as far as they're concerned, like that, is a handout, literally a handout. And you're doing it because you expect something to come from it. Some tacit recognition that you're giving it and why you're giving it, some implied political duress. But a cash transfer based on the Buxton proposal is a right of every Guyanese to be enshrined in law. So you're not getting it because some bureaucrat decide that he can send around some people to a particular area with a car with vouchers and they treat them nice in the area. That's why. That's the only way you can breathe dignity back into giving people money. If you hand people money and they feel that they become indebted to you, or it seems a handout on your part, it's a dehumanizing thing. And that's not the way we want to build the confidence of Guyanese. So it's a completely different matter altogether. A handout and a cash transfer based on Buxton proposals are two very different things. One's a universal basic income that we give to people. Universal by definition, basic by definition, and income by definition. It follows the universal rules governing that. And the sustainable development goals, the very things that we sign up to, that creates the opportunity for this to happen. And that is why I was writing at one point in time, not too long ago, about the compatibility between the sustainable development goals, the cash transfers, the Buxton cash transfers, and the universal basic income principle that was adopted. Because we're trying to create a situation where poverty is eliminated, because that is a fundamental right of people not to live in poverty if the society can afford it. And there are very few societies where that cannot be afforded. Ghana is blessed with many things. We have a lot of resources. We have as much resources that are renewable in energy as we have now already found in oil and gas. Some of the things that we're doing are already creating the conditions that are antithetical to the interests of Guyanese. For example, in the budget, the government is boasting of how they have a local content policy. Now, there's a simple truth which many people do not fully understand, but they must recognize. What you can do for your country, other countries can do for their citizens. So once you begin to see that Guyana must produce goods only for Guyanese, other countries will say that they should produce goods only for themselves and by themselves. We live in a world where trade takes place. If as a small country we want to violate that, we have to be able to do it in a smart way. We have to recognize that we were penalized because of the way in which the policy was adopted in the first instance. And it didn't recognize the difference in capacity to trade on the basis of comparative advantage. And we should not be putting in writing that the sector of let's say, consultancy services must be 100% Guyanese or 60% or 70%. Once you begin to do that, you invite legal challenges. And once legal challenges come, you become subject to the workings and rulings of the WTO, to which we remember. We sign up to end in this type of practice globally. When America wants to do it, they can get away with it. Trump just gets on the telephone and says, dealing with the Chinese. He don't follow no law in the United States. And nobody will think of challenging him. But we, a small country, can expose ourselves to those difficulties in the global environment. So we don't want a local content law that is written down in any book. Because once you put it in law, it becomes challengeable. And I think they've already been challenged, if I'm not mistaken, in that the CARICOM governments have already, some countries have, or the private sector, beginning to challenge whether it's legal, yeah. You never make an elementary mistake like that. And that is why I'm saying I'm surprised at the lack of sagacity in the governments we've had. The previous government was not any different. They too were hustling to create a local content law. They never thought of discussing it first, as if it was something that made sense. But once you begin to go down that type of road, remember the people who control the international system are very clever. They don't do things by half measures. They set up rules that they can violate, and with impunity. But we can't. So we have to be careful either not to join the rule-making system, or if we're going to join it, join it in name only. Never put anything that binds our or conditions our response to follow it slavishly. That is what being one of the biggest mistakes.
Yes. Tacuma Ogunseye, let me get you in here. Tacuma Ogunseye, let's talk.
Are you hearing me?
Yes, let's talk about the politics of this budget. We have hinted at it. We've talked about the ethnic consequences. We've talked about the social consequences of this kind of budget. Brother Thomas, they've introduced the foreign policy consequences in terms of foreign trade. What is the PPP trying to do with this budget from a purely political standpoint?
If you listen to the minister very carefully and you listen to the vice president, I haven't heard, and the president, they're tying the budget unapologetically to the PPP's manifesto. And for them, okay, their manifesto is paramount, regardless of what is the size of the population they represent. I think that they want to foster the domination of the PPP over the country. And I think that they're doing everything in their power to achieve that. And I think that it becomes imperative on the political opposition and the social forces to recognize that that is a path to destruction. And we have to push back against that before it gathers more strength as the oil flows of money begin to come in a larger and larger quantities. I think that whether we like it or not, the PPP have forced the country and the political opposition in a situation where they have to engage in a major fight to turn this back now, because to wait will be too late. And I'm concerned, and I think that this is tied for me with the way in which they treat the public sector workers. Now, I think the PPP budget and the PPP government has been the most anti-working class government we have had post-independence. The level of disrespect they have shown to the working people, and particularly the public sector workers, which are the government employees, and the government attitude to workers create the basis for the private sector and foreign companies dealings with the workers. If a government is contemptuous and treats its workers with poor consideration, then it opens the floodgate for the private sector and the foreign businesses that may come to Guyana to do likewise. I can't remember in the history of this country, either under the Burnham regime or the Jagan regime, that we have had a budget that represents such a significant historical moment, and the budget has no explicit allocations for the increase of public sector workers, or no clear statement by the government how it intends to deal with public sector workers' wages. And I think that this is a great disrespect for the Guyanese working class, which is a significant part of the working people. And I know the African community constitutes a very large part of the public sector. And when one bear in mind the 23 years of PPP previous rule, and the fact that they imposed deliberately a policy of keeping public sector workers' wages at starvation level, and they have now demonstrated their determination to continue that policy, I think it adds to the political crisis. And it is forcing both the working people acting as a class, the poor and powerless acting as a special group, and the African community, and I will add the Amerindian community, to find some political way of really pushing back. And we have to appeal to the Indian working people and the progressive elements in the Indian working class to recognize that this budget and this government has created a political scenario that whether persons like it or not, you have to be confrontational with them in order to reverse the political negatives that they have perpetuated in the equation. And I think that unfortunately, another unfortunate aspect of this budget is that in terms of the oil and gas potential, we have been living with daily, doses of anti-oil propaganda that oil industry and the gas will lead to no significant development to Guyanese. And what this budget has done is to give life to those forces that have been perpetuating that line of argument. And we in the WPA, have a totally different approach. Our approach is that oil and gas open up new possibilities for improvement in people's lives. And we are giving people reasons to fight against the PPP and even the oil companies. But what this budget has done is to re-energize the other forces that are engaged in an anti-oil mission, and is strengthening that political tendency in the country, and it is weakening the country ability to fight the PPP, and objectively, the country ability to fight the oil companies to get better oil contracts down the road. And I think it's almost a disastrous situation that put us in.
Brother Ogunseye, you've making a very important point there as far as the WPA is concerned. That the WPA is arguing that oil is real, oil wealth is real, wealth is coming, regardless of the weaknesses of the contracts and so on, that the wealth is coming to the country. And so that our opposition to the way in which the PPP is governing, in a sense, is a struggle for our share of the oil well that is coming, and that the two are not divorced. Let me bring you in here. You're a younger member of the WPA. Kidakie, are you there?
Yes, yes.
You're a younger member of the WPA, and you are out there every morning engaging with the audiences on this issue of oil wealth, the PPP's dominance, the ethnic problems in the country quite complex. And we see what people try to do is to take one issue and isolate it from the others. What I'm hearing tonight is the ethnic problem, the class issue, that is the ethnic issue, the class issue, the issue of the oil wealth for the country. They're all tied up together. What are you hearing from your audiences in the mornings that says to you that the WPA's approach to analysis of the situation and how we move forward is concerned?
Well, basically, considering the positions that I have recognized, the contributions that the audience make generally on the program, indeed, all of these issues are tied up. They're all tied together, and people are identifying them as such. That the way the PPP manages the oil wealth is definitely in a manner that will create a wider gap, not only between the haves and the have-not, but a wider gap between ethnic groups in terms of what they possess and who gets dispossessed, right? Likewise, a lot of people see this, what I would say, biased management of the oil wealth and the economy in general, the resources of the country in general, as having the potential to pit the ethnic groups against each other and create what many might call a dilemma. So what my audience is saying, what our audience is saying, is in a whole big way wrapped up with what the WP is recognizing, that all of these issues are tied together. They each have an impact on one another. And the audience, as a matter of fact, just recently, some folks have been saying, listen, because of the divisive nature of this government and its disrespect for the representation of a large portion of the Guyanese society, maybe the time has come for us to consider division and the splitting of the resources.
Let me stop you there and ask you this pointed question. Do you get from your interaction with your audiences that there is space for a new transformative politics in Guyana? Because what I hear you all are saying is, right, is that there are these problems, and these problems cannot be solved in the old way. This party versus that party, this race versus that race, and the piecemeal thing. We're going to move this government and we're going to put another one, and so on. When I hear the WA saying that there is need for transformative politics, what you're hearing from your interaction with people on a daily basis, are you seeing the possibilities for a transformative politics?
Yes, the audience generally also have been calling for that kind of transformation. The audience I talk to and I listen to on a daily basis are, for example, big on coalition politics. They seem to believe that with coalition, there is likely to be a better management of resources, a more inclusive government, right? And so a lot of people have been saying, look, we need coalition politics, and coalition is necessary to remove the PPP from its current position of dominance. So yes, I've been hearing from my audience that there's possibility for a more transformative politics in this country.
Professor Thomas, let me get you back in here. And I actually use that T word, transformation. You have been involved with the movement for transformative politics from the time as we say, Noah was in short pants. Your name is attached to a title called Dependence and Transformation. And you've been through it all. Are you optimistic about a new transformative politics to deal with the moment before us? Professor Thomas? We seem to have lost Professor Thomas. Tacuma, I'll put the same question to you. We seem to have lost both Professor Thomas and Tacuma Ogunseye. In case you're just joining us,
Can you hear me?
I'm hearing you now, CY.
Okay.
And the question I was asking you.
I heard the question.
Okay, go right ahead.
No, I think that at this point in time, there's still a big ideological battle that we have to fight. I think there's a populist view that dates back to the last 2 decades or so ago, which sees changes in Ghana in the traditional ways in which it was interpreted back then. I think over the years, things have become far more complex. I think the nature of the issues of classes have changed a lot. The behavior forms both at the level of the international environment and the national environment, as well as the regional environment, has changed. The ways in which the system operates itself at the local, regional, and national and international level has also changed a lot. And sometimes there's too much of a willingness to translate those old orthodoxies to interpret the processes we face here today. There are a lot more complex nuances than that we find. I think, some of the areas of concern with oil and gas are very complex. A lot of it hinges on what your perspective is about whether and how soon we transform the world from a dependence on carbon-based energies to non-carbon-based energies. But the route towards that is a very complex and scientific route. It's not something that can be determined only by wishing. And the paths that are being pursued do not allow anybody to confidently predict which one will dominate. So there's a lot of hyperbole that comes out from the environmental view that I think distorts reality. I don't know if any of you heard CNN News this morning. For example, there's a talk about the success in some European physics department in nuclear fusion, which creates the possibilities at a very minuscule level, micro level, of generating power out of fusion like what it takes place in the sun, which is not carbon-based because we rely on the sun's energy. And that is what we fight for when we fight for solar energy. Which would make all these issues we talk about with gas and oil and the carbon emissions and pollution disappear in the next 10 to 20 years. It is now no guarantee, but I'm saying the complex possibilities that exist in this dimension must give us caution when we try to predict what is going to happen in the future. There's absolutely no certainty behind anybody, whatever they tell you, that oil or gas has a future of, say, the next 50 years. It could be 50 years, it could be 100 years, it could be never. ever changing because of these new inventions that they don't need to change because we find ways of producing energy in the future that will not require this. But I think in the debate, we sometimes don't put enough store or emphasis on these creations of humankind. Whatever we're doing here, we are also developing our brain consciousness. And technology has become an independent force, a non-predictable force. And if you think back, as I love to tell people who come here and tell me that we were better off in our school days than we are now, I say my school day never had a cell phone. And if I have a cell phone now, it has more computing power than any country in the world at that point in time when I was a schoolboy. So things change so fast we don't recognize them. And I think these influences people do not perceive. And they tend to, I think, act, and with a lag, using the ideas of 2 decades ago, 3 decades ago, to deal with issues in this present decade. And a lot of it is based on that ignorance.
Mhm.
Like, for example, there's one firm or some international financial something, institute or something like that writes a lot about the papers. You believe that that is an independent, you know, research agency. But if you ever look up on Google who finances it, Rockefeller. And the product was split between Rockefeller, Standard Oil, and ExxonMobil. So they're playing their political interest in the country. And yet it's touted here as lead analysis of where Ghana is going and where it is, what it's doing. So sometimes there's a level of ignorance that operates within a society gives you cause for concern.
Mhm.
Because when you become an agent of that type of thing, and just got for Google, that's your former Canada. And you see the efforts that are being made by Canadian intellectuals to drive it out of Canada. They don't want them reporting anything to do with Canadian oil. Because they also make a lot of elementary, I could tell you, elementary errors in the nature of the analysis. Because they don't understand the business.
Right.
And to me, they don't seem to understand basic economics. And when you look at the background of some of the people, they come from running a company or a department in the New York State. They don't come from no academic or professional background. And you bring in the one where there's not a frontal group. But that becomes the standard from which we judge and make decisions and recommendations in the country. Because ignorance feeds ignorance. And it's a reinforcing thing. And we remove ourselves from the realities of the need to understand where we are today. That is my main concern. My main feeling is that we're not encouraging the development of independent analyses of just where we stand. We take one or the other orthodoxy.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to encourage innovation in thought or anything like that. It's too hard. Take too much time.
Innovation of thought. Tacuma,
Of
first,
course.
let me bring you in here, Tacuma, because I think Professor Thomas is raising a very pivotal point there. Part of what propelled the WPA in the 1970s to the forefront of Guyanese politics was precisely what Thomas, C.Y. Thomas raised there. Was a thorough analysis of the historical moment. Um, uh, and that analysis was brought into a connection with the working people struggle. The ability to make that analysis and then join it to the struggle of the people. And so a path was developed, and the mobilization followed that. No, we see a frustration with our people and their leaders, especially on the opposition side. We see it on this program, on other programs, we see it in the marketplace, on the street. There's a frustration that the leadership is not up to the task. The leadership itself seems to be out of touch with what the people are saying and what the needs of the people are. And it points to the complexity Thomas is talking about. What has changed from the 1970s to now? It's technology. We're now an oil-producing nation. We have new generations who have been socialized differently from the generations of the past. Is the WPA up to the task of again pointing a pathway for our people in terms of how we deal with the myriad problems? We seem sometimes to reduce the problem to Orphan Alley or Jack Doe or Granger or Norton or Harmon or PPP or PNC. And I think what I'm hearing from you guys is that the thing is much more complex than that. But I think the problem is that the leadership has not been able to move our people beyond the presentism of the struggle to something larger. It's the WPA. First of all, have you been having that discussion? And do you think you have something to offer in terms of creating this new pathway? You have to unmute yourself.
Are you hearing me now?
Yes, yes.
Okay, I think Professor Thomas have already begun in his articulation to state some of the WPA's thinking on these matters. I think that the country has suffered from a lack of active intellectual progressive cadres engaging in revolutionary discourse and struggle. In the 70s, you know that you had the Clive Thomas, the Rup Narines, the Kakwayana, the Jagons, all kinds of people. Okay, Walter Rodney, revolutionary-minded intellectuals who were actively engaged in analyzing the situation in the country, the region, and the world, and trying to lift the political consciousness of the people, okay, in a way that will make them better able to develop a response to defend their own person, their own individual interests, their class interests, and national interests. So the political discourse to me today has been reduced to personality and to party in the most narrow and backward sense. And that, and to give you an example, in the heart of the election crisis, the post-election crisis, I have been engaging in discussions with a lot of our APMU, AFC constituency in Derry, Kitty, and areas of Georgetown on the possible, outcomes and so forth. And almost to a man, their consciousness was centered mainly on Jagdio and the PPP. Even when you try to tell them that, you have to look at the other external forces, the Americans and the Canadians and other people who are, trying to influence things. Our people was literally blind to that. Or even if they recognize it, they give it a very low priority. The point I'm trying to make is that the politics, the way in which the parties present and cultivate political discussions and political education or miseducation is in a way that is not appropriate for the historical and the challenges of the moment. And I think that we suffer that deficit, a deficit in political knowledge among the people. And I think that, we in the WPA have been conscious of that, and we have been discussing ways and means of how to break out of that. But we have to bear in mind that the WPA has great resources limitations. We're in a political atmosphere where we don't have much media friends, and we don't have, recently with the COVID, have put in our hands, yourself, David, and Kidakie, and the WPA in general, and other forces, some extra capacity to influence political discourse. And I think you all have been doing an excellent job, both as individual programs and both in your collective approach as the WPA. And I think that you have opened up a new array of possibilities at the level of intellectual political discourse that move us away from the narrow discourse that only see the way in which the individual main parties want the people to see, and not to have these more profound discussions that is more holistic and universal and regional, that plays an important factor in the political equation. I just want to raise one more issue which Clive may want to educate us in the nation on. It is this whole thing about the Santiago principles and the role in which the whole Santiago argument seems to have been influencing, the oil discussions and the national resource funds discussion. I know a lot of people, are caught up in whether we should spend all the oil money or save the oil money for future generations, and that complexity. Now, I don't know, but if Brother Thomas may want to give us some education on it, because it is an area of a lot of confusion, and I think that where we could get clarity on some of these matters also, help to strengthen the political culture.
And that's a very important point. And we're running low on time, and I don't want to start that discussion. I'll bring you guys back, Professor Thomas, back to talk about that whole National Natural Resource Fund. I don't want to start it now, and we don't have enough time to really get into the meat of it. So we're going to hold that for the time being. Lawrence Houston, an old PNC man, he said, I concur with Tacuma. See my previous comments above. Lawrence, of course, comes out of that left-wing, radical, progressive a wing of our politics in the 1970s and the 1980s. And we struggle on this program and other programs to really try to bring it all together. Look, Mr. Stu is not just about Jack Dio being corrupt. It's about something larger than that, But in order to move people to that wider thing, we have to do the painful work of moving the analysis beyond the need tomorrow for something for us to feel good. That we have to get our people back into the mode of struggle for ideas, struggle for small victories, and to recognize small victories when we get them, and not to only see the end of the tunnel, but to see the path along there, and how in the process we are not transforming only the opposition, but we're transforming the country. Kidakie, I bring you in here again because you are out there every day, and you are in the presence of the pressure to keep the discourse narrow. Tell us a little bit about what you have learned as someone coming out of the WPA and dealing with this need out there for something dramatic, to happen tomorrow?
Well, that's perhaps the most difficult question you've asked me for the evening.
Well, you WPA, you socialize to answer difficult questions.
But what I've learned, well, in short, I've learned that there seems to be a major disconnect um, between leadership and the people. That the people seem to want to go in one direction, while the leadership which they look to is not necessarily or appears not to necessarily favor that direction, right? As if I can wrap it up in you quoting one of our viewers, I think just this morning, the likes of Granger and Harmon didn't see any value in protest and confrontation. And Aubrey Norton, as new leader of the PNC and chairman of the APNU, apparently doesn't see any value in protest and confrontation. Whereas what the people are calling for is protest and confrontation.
How do you shape that protest and confrontation? That's the
Well,
problem. That's the $1,000,000 question. I'm not asking you for an answer. I'm saying disconnect. The disconnect that you're talking about is indeed the problem. And the disconnect is not, in my view, necessarily the people want to go in a certain way, the leaders want to go in another way. It's about the complexity of the problem that the leadership is not directly having with the people. You know, if you give people the impression that you can come in today or tomorrow and solve all the problems, get people on the streets, and everything, you know, what Bob Marley said, great God will come from the sky and make everybody high. Right? If you do that, you find yourself in the problem that we find ourselves in. No great God will come from the sky and make everybody high in Guyana tomorrow. All right? Okay? We are going to get high when we commit ourselves to an alternative way of dealing with the complex problems that we face, the complex challenges. You're not going to change the oil contracts tomorrow. And if the oil contract is changed tomorrow, it still is not going to make everybody feel high. But there is an analysis out there that is saying change the oil contract. It's a bad contract. And if we change it, first of all, that we can change it just by saying we can change it. Second, that if we change it, we'll solve all the problems. And I give those comments to point to the complexity of the problem. But I'm the junior professor here. Let's go to the senior professor. C.Y. Thomas, please weigh in on what you've been hearing from your comrades. Unmute yourself. You have to unmute CY.
I'm trying to do that.
Yeah, we're hearing you now. No,
We're not hearing you anymore.
we're not hearing you now.
You hearing me now?
Yes.
Loud and clear.
Yeah, okay. I was saying I think the difficulties are manifold. First of all, we have to try to understand what it is that the PPC means when they talk about unity. Because as far as they're concerned, they are proceeding with an authentic sense of unity at their very best. That is when their supporters are advocating their ideals. But the limitations of that, they themselves don't see. And we cannot perceive all of it either. Because the response that we get is that we try to produce an alternative reality to that. And I feel the difference is that the PPP is caught up in a syndrome in which unity means something that we used to talk about in the past, unifying on my terms. I'm defining how it is you can be compatible with me. The old top-down principle. So if you are a relatively junior political force, and that comes for everybody else with the PPP, and you want to be unified with me, these are the grounds and the principles on which you operate. It's important, therefore, for the opposition to engage that, not simply by conjuring up another alternative reality, but convincing the people who are supporting the PPP that their vision of unity is not really unity. It's not a real unity, it's an apparent unity, because it's founded entirely in creating mirror images of themselves in another political grouping. Now, that political task is a pretty difficult one to work through. But the type of problem that we have in this age, I think of the situation in the United States, with Trump actually being a president, trying to mount a coup against his own constitution, where he doesn't want to give up power. And he sees, therefore, the political process in a way in which his supporters share his view, and you can't convince them otherwise. But it has a view that has nothing to do with reality. So this disjuncture creates an impossible situation. And it means that that is a problem for the United States alone, but I think it's a global problem. How are we going to move forward? Because the stability of the global system has been founded so far on the relative stability of the leading regimes. And once the United States can no longer claim itself as a paragon of virtue, its standards disappear. The same thing will happen within territories like Guyana. The notion of democratic change, democratic politics, and the way forward disappears. And I've long argued that we are committed to democratic politics because of our historical experiences with non-democratic politics as slaves, and the products of being products of other people. So we have I think, a fairly complex situation to handle. And I think that this is so complex that we may have to find some time to explore some of these themes in maybe another program.
Yes.
Because it's hard to know how to compress them. Because it works itself through the system and makes it very difficult to promote change. And ultimately, unless we have change, we're not going to resolve the contradictions in Guyana. On the basis of the present structures, there's not enough stability in any of them to take us forward. Where they're not weakened internally, they're weakened by external dependence, external patronage. So we have a difficult situation to handle. And I feel I would like this to be a subject that we probably consider some greater depth, unless people feel it might be too intellectual a matter to raise. It sounds too much like abstract politics. But I feel this, I think that we can't get change unless we have ideas. A friend of mine used to say he's no longer in Guyana. I don't think he's still alive, but at least 30 years ago, he left to go to the Bahamas. But he always told me that people always contrast ideas and practice. But he believed, he used to teach at the University of Ghana, that there's nothing more practical, and I agreed with him, than a good idea.
A good
And if
idea.
you think about it, it's really true. In every situation you find yourselves in, you find to find a way out of a dilemma, as we are doing now. There's no more practical a solution than if you can get a good idea to come out of these discussions. That it creates a thesis around which you can work. It gives you insight and it opens up the possibilities. So I think these efforts that we have to make, this is I'm not a big believer in the Bible, so I think we give them these talents because it is expected that this is an independent force in the universe, the capacity of human beings to think and to have consciousness. I think that distinguishes us from every other species. There's nothing else in this entire universe that can exist or ever existed that has a consciousness of itself, life, of death, and non-existence. Animals don't have a sense of consciousness. They will be terrified at being injured, that killed or whatever it is. But they don't have a sense of consciousness. And I believe that operates as an independent force. And therefore we should draw upon it to see how it is that we can solve or begin to think how we can resolve some of the problems here. And that usually requires some amount of attention and thought. But most people don't feel thought
Yes.
was
Yes. Thank you very much, Brother CY. OG, any closing thoughts?
Okay, are you hearing me?
Yes, go ahead.
I want to support Clive's observation. I want to add a whole WPA perception that the liberation of a people, a liberation, if it is to mean anything, it has to be a liberation that comes through the people. And if we're talking about transformation, okay, that will lead to liberation, I think that is a little more long-term agenda and will take a little more time. But I think that the challenge that we're facing politically that you raised earlier, and that is you throw to Kidakie when you ask him to speak to the views of his viewers. The challenge that we're facing as political practitioners is that while we're correct in recognizing that education and consciousness is important for action and outcome, we have to find a balance between that, because I'm convinced that education for liberation has to come, okay, in the actual process of liberation, and it can be abstract. Put it another way, I think that what the masses are saying is that we got to struggle against the PPP in various forms like protests. And I agree with them, because you have to find some way of restricting the PPP's onslaught in the country and to force them to rethink. And protests also have a way of galvanizing, large sections of the population, as you even see in Canada, not to even currently. That have to go side by side with the level of education we, the WPA, is arguing for in order to have the perfect outcome. I'm just using perfect, thing. So, but the point I'm trying to label is that we don't want people to believe that the WPA is just for the struggle ideas abstractly. We believe that the struggle ideas have to be concretized, okay, and proven and refined in the day-to-day struggle of the people, which involve protests, struggle for better wages, and the total engagement with the regime and the various social contradictions in the country.
And Kidakie Amsterdam, you have the last say. Among us here, like I said, you were the youngest. You were out there all the time. You were bombarded every day with the cries of the people for this regime. They call it all kinds of names, to be gone. And Brother Ogunseye talks about the balancing of what Walter Rodney talked about, the people on the move, and that out of the people on the move comes ideas. And Quiana said it's about taking those ideas and giving it back to the people as a kind of political nourishment, so that there is an interrelationship between practice and ideas. A practice without ideas is incomplete. And ideas that are not grounded in practice is also incomplete. Given that, your closing thoughts.
I
know I'm trusting you tonight, but in the big league.
My closing thoughts. My closing thoughts. I noticed that my closing thoughts. My closing thoughts may not always be in keeping with the WPA principle, but
we wanted to keep it with the WPA. You're on the WPA. You're representing the WPA tonight.
I know. I've heard Tacuma spoke about the balancing of what the people want and education. I do support that position that, quote unquote, we as leaders have a responsibility to not only listen to the cries of the people and recognize where the people want to go, but we have to be that guiding light, if I can call it that, in pointing the way. Right? Like you say, we have to take the ideas of the people and refine it and hand it back as some political nourishment. Because the fact is, in many instances, what you hear from the man on the ground is based purely, in many instances, on what they feel at the time. And so many folks don't look to the issue in the long run or in the medium to long term. And so that responsibility is on us to examine what is proposed, refine it, and then see how best we can work it with the people. But at the end of the day, again, Tacuma alluded to it, us changing the current situation is dependent a whole lot on the people themselves.
On the people themselves. Coffee says here, struggle now, therefore we must act now. Cheryl says, Sue is Jagdio's boss, and Vice is his nightmare. You don't see him keeping press conferences since the interview. And I think Lawrence wraps it up nicely for us. Politics 101 is always stimulating. We do not always agree with the various propositions here, but it is always stimulating and give rise and birth to new ideas to facilitate our struggle for liberation, social, political, economic, and national. And that sums up our approach, I think, in the sense that we feel that our problems are so complex that we need all ideas coming from all directions in order to work us through the hard questions that people ask every day. Why are Guyanese people not on the streets? Why are the leaders not bringing the people on the street? Why are we allowing the PPP to get away? Why is the PPP so barefaced? All of these questions point to the fact that we are dealing with a problem that has been building up not just last year or the year before, but it has come with us from the Middle Passage to the present. And what that confrontation 2 years ago, those 5 months, with some shallow people reduced to some rigging, but that those 5 months brought into focus the historical problems that we have been dealing with for decades and centuries. And our task is, how do we shape this new configuration so that our people can, for the first time, speak and act and live with some confidence that they're free. And that is what we are grappling with. That is what the WPA attempts to put on the table tonight. It's not the kind of red meat that we're accustomed to. It's not the kind of cussing down the PPP and so on. But at the end of the day, it's undermining the people, because they do not want us to have this kind of discourse. They want us to say that they're mad and crazy people. And perhaps they are. But what we are saying is that there is a method to that madness. And that madness comes out of something that is profound. That is profound. We're going to continue this discussion. Thank you very much, Tacuma, Kidakie, Professor Clive Thomas, lots of people in the audience. Very glad to see you. You know, sometimes we beat ourselves up because we say we don't recognize our own treasures. I remember my first visit to Jamaica must have been in 1989 or thereabout. And I was staying in a home, private home. And when I got there, the lady, the mother of the home, she said, "Oh, you from Guyana?" I said, "Yes." She said, "You know C.Y. Thomas?" I said, "Yes." She said, "He taught me at UWI in Jamaica there." And she said, he was the greatest teacher I have ever had. I felt so proud, because Thomas is Guyanese, but more than that, is somebody that I know, I interact with as a brother, as a big brother. And the treasure that we have in our society, sometimes we don't get the most out of it because of the politics that reduces everything to us versus them. We're glad for Professor Thomas. We're glad he can come on to this social media platform, someone of another generation, and try to grapple with the problems and the issues and the challenges we have. Thank you, Professor Thomas. Thank you on behalf of Politics 101 audience, and we hope we can bring you back more often. And thanks to Kidakie and Tacuma for keeping the tradition going. This year is 50 years since Walter Rodney wrote that seminal book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, which spoke to the issues that we were in today, the relationship between underdevelopment and development, and how we take out of that historical underdevelopment. Good night. Good night. I want to say, have a good weekend. But in Guyana, things move so fast. Try to get some relaxation during the week, during the weekend, and we'll see you next week.
Please help keep Politics 101 on social. Please help keep Politics 101 on social media and broadcast television. If you are in North America, please donate via Cash App or PayPal.
If you are in Guyana and the Caribbean and don't have access to Cash App and PayPal, email your pledge to dhines6106@aol.com and we will direct you how to get your donation to us. Thank you in advance for your donation.